Professor Robert Patman, thank you for joining us. 20 years on from September the 11th, what are your memories of that day?
Being woken up about 3 o'clock in the morning by a telephone call and me not really taking the message very seriously, something about planes crashing into buildings in New York. But when I got up at 6 and switched the TV on, that's exactly what happened. And yeah, like many other people, stunned by what happened. But in a sense, it wasn't that surprising, given the fact that al-Qaeda had in fact been gunning for the United States since about 93, actually. So 9/11 was the culmination of nearly a decade of activities against the United States.
And America's initial response, which drew a lot of worldwide support.
It did. I think America enjoyed an enormous groundswell of support initially. Even countries which had traditionally been distant from the United States, like China and Russia, expressed solidarity with the United States. I think most people believe this was an appalling act, nearly 3,000 innocent people killed. But in addition, I think the Bush administration, although it talked quite tough, was initially quite cautious. It got a UN resolution. It put together an international coalition of which New Zealand was part. New Zealand was very quick to express its solidarity with the United States. And having asked the Taliban to hand over, the Taliban government of the day, to hand over the al-Qaeda leadership, which they refused to do, the United States on the 7th of October 2001 launched a military operation which New Zealand was involved in. There was an SAS unit there. And basically the Taliban were quick. Well, by the end of November, they were displaced. They were in disarray, and I think it was 8 al-Qaeda camps were largely decimated. And so it looked like this was quite a promising start to the military campaign against terrorism. But I think it lost track, Darryl. If there was a turning point, I would have to say it was America's decision in 2003 to invade Iraq, a country who had nothing to do with 9/11. And that led to a massive loss of international support. New Zealand, for example, which had supported the operation in Afghanistan, drew a line against the operation in Iraq. It was one of many countries which recognized that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 and believed that the United States was losing focus strategically. And unfortunately, for the United States, I think Helen Clark and the likes of Germany and France, which also opposed the invasion, were proved right. That the invasion of Iraq turned out to be a full-blown insurgency. And the irony was that al-Qaeda actually got a foothold in Iraq after America invaded, whereas before they invaded, they never had a foothold. And in addition, unfortunately, because the United States was so preoccupied with the Iraq war after 2003, the Taliban were able to regroup and reappear as a potent fighting force in Afghanistan. So the gains they made in the first 2 years, I think, were effectively wiped out once the United States got ensnared in Iraq.
It's often puzzled me what they actually saw in Iraq, apart from, well, there was always a whole lot of protest against the whole no blood for oil thing. It seemed a bit short-sighted at best.
Well, the official explanation was that Saddam Hussein might make weapons of mass destruction available to al-Qaeda. There were lots of people in the US intelligence community who scoffed at this, recognized that Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator, but a secular leader who was actually deadly opposed, he was, really opposed to al-Qaeda, a fundamentalist, religious but terrorist organization. And if Saddam Hussein ever got his hands on al-Qaeda operatives, he hung them. So, I think, and the other thing was here, Darryl, that the rationale given that they would find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was never borne out. So the official rationale for going into Iraq was undermined quite quickly. And then the secondary rationale that America wanted to establish a democracy in the Middle East and that this would spread like domino fashion throughout the Middle East that proved problematic as well. So, and the other thing we shouldn't lose sight of is that the US invasion of Iraq undermined America's reputation internationally, that it wasn't prepared to play by the rules of the United Nations Security Council, and it damaged America's international standing. And it also led to the emergence of Islamic State, a rival to al-Qaeda in subsequent years. So it was very damaging. And I don't think the United States global campaign against terrorism has ever really recovered from that. And for the much of the post-9/11 period, I think successive administrations have struggled with this problem of transnational terrorism. As I speak to you today, on the 20th anniversary, the sobering thing is the terrorist threat has actually widened. It now consists of not only Islamic State and al-Qaeda, but also increasingly white supremacist terrorists, which we've experienced firsthand in this country. So, you know, in a sense, the problem has actually got worse in terms of the number of groups engaging in this sort of violent extremism.
Sadly, it would suggest we haven't actually learned a damn thing.
I think it shows that the most powerful country in the world, the United States, found it very difficult to adapt to the post-Cold War environment, the post-9/11 environment, in which terrorism doesn't recognize borders. And, you know, terrorism is almost analogous, Darryl, to COVID-19, in that these groups, they're shadowy, they don't often have a base, and actually they now seek to recruit people through the sophistications of their social media operations. New Zealand has experienced two drastic experience. We've experienced two cases of terrorism in the last few years, and both cases, the paramount attackers in Christchurch and recently in New Lynn were both motivated by their experience of the internet. And so it is a worrying problem. Geography is no longer a protection against this. And I think the United States has struggled to come to terms with this. I mean, declaring war on terror was very much a traditional response. This was a very weak group of less than 3,000 people, and yet the United States went into hyper military preparedness. The president described himself as a war president. It wasn't a war. It was basically a political challenge. And unfortunately, I think the very military-centered response was a mismatch with the problem that the United States faced. And unfortunately, we still face this problem.
Indeed. Professor Robert Patman, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.